Thank you, Jaz O'Hara, for joining us on this open-ended conversation. You've had a year. Oh, thank you for being here. I know we've been waiting, and I think that when we started open-ended, you were on our very first list of people, and we had this conversation with our team where I said, "Oh, I know Jaz." And everyone was like, "No way, you know Jaz, you didn't tell us you knew her already. Like, why didn't you say this immediately?" So there's been a lot of excitement to have you come and join our community, and we're super, super grateful for you to do it. So I'm glad we're having this conversation, even though we're so far apart. And I hope I can see you soon. But I just do want to start with how we first met, because it wasn't a coincidence. We met. Yeah, we go way back. And we met through an incredible person, Robert Mull, who maybe you can talk about a little bit and your relationship with him. And it was part of a conversation we were hosting for CARE International in London, looking at the architecture of displacement. And, Robert basically put me in touch with you, and it was this incredible opening up to me of this world, of your work, and also this movement that you represent and you have built in what I see as activism for a new kind of storytelling on behalf of people who are disenfranchised. So so I wonder if we could just maybe start a little bit with that, is how you know Robert, how your work brought you to him, and then we can talk, of course, about the Worldwide Tribe and your amazing journey to where you are today.
Oh, it would be a pleasure to talk about Robert. It's been years, has it been years? Yeah, it probably has actually, since I've seen him, because of this crazy last year that's happened. But we met in 2015, I think it was, early days of the Calais Jungle, when I was traveling back and forth to Calais a lot. And he was a friend of a friend, we have a mutual friend who had been coming with us to Calais, Mark. And he'd been doing some incredible work on the ground with us. And he was like, "You have to meet my friend Robert." So it kind of happened like that, people wanted to get involved, and there became a bigger and bigger network. The Worldwide Tribe, I guess, is an apt name for it. So Robert came along to one of those trips to Calais, and poor Robert probably didn't know what to expect. We bundled him in the car with a load of stuff, like probably one or two of my brothers and a camera, and I don't know what else we had with us. But we brought him with us, and he came initially to my mum and dad's house, because my mum and dad were kind of halfway to Calais from London. So I grew up in Kent, and they are in Tunbridge. So essentially when you get the train down to Folkestone to go on the Eurostar, it's halfway there. So I think we all met at my mum and dad's house, if I'm remembering correctly, and then went to Calais. And then on the way back, we stopped and had dinner at my mum and dad's house. So he got a well-rounded overview or a little snippet into my life, that trip, I guess, which was the experience in Calais, which I think was very overwhelming and crazy for him at the time, because, as I say, it was early days. It was still when there was a lot of just lack of coordination, I guess, and in the camp, and it was very overwhelming, and distribution was very crazy, and the whole thing, I think, was something that most people living in the UK had never seen anything like it before. But then not just that, he also saw a little snippet into our life at home, and it was not long after my first two foster brothers had joined my family. So my mum and dad foster 4 unaccompanied minors. I have 4 little brothers who live at home right now, who are all from 4 different countries. And they all came to the UK as child refugees. And Robert, I guess, saw an insight into the reason why I do this work, which stems from that home life, I guess. Those boys, they're really my reason why. They were the reason why I first went to Calais. So little did I know what would happen from Robert going to Calais that first time. He's an architect, by the way, for anyone watching this, and a professor of architecture, and he's very incredible in what he does. We've talked a lot about the concept of home, what it means to people, what it means when it's taken away, how you can find that again. We've had some beautiful in-depth conversations about that, and he's gone on to do incredible work in Izmir, in Turkey, in Greece, to support refugees and displaced people across Europe and the Middle East, actually.
for the benefit of anyone listening, just what was Calais then? What was the jungle then? And maybe, what is it now? But really, what were you entering? And where were people from? Where had they come from?
So the Calais Jungle at that time in 2015 was home to about 3,000 people, and it was referred to as a refugee camp, but that's not actually accurate. What it actually was an informal settlement. A slum is more like an authentic portrayal of what it was. It was people that had nowhere to go and had been told that they would be tolerated on this bit of wasteland in Calais that had asbestos in the ground, that wasn't used for anything. It was wasteland. It was outside of the centre of Calais, and people had, as I say, been told, you will be left alone here, which didn't last for very long, unfortunately. The whole place was bulldozed in 2016. Not long afterwards, and now refugees and asylum seekers are no longer tolerated in this area at all. So the situation has changed a lot, but at the time they were allowed to put up tents, and they were allowed to, I guess, create this very informal settlement. And it grew over the years that I've been visiting, or I had been visiting, until it was demolished in 2016. But between 2015 and 2016, it grew to about 10,000 people. And visually, I guess, what it looked like at that time when I first went there was a load of tents and makeshift shelters, and people actually, in an incredible way, had formed, what they did need. So there was a church when I first went there. There was very few structures, but there was a church. And when I say a church, I mean it was made from tarpaulin and bits of wood. But it was beautiful all the same. And there were a couple of mosques, and people were starting to create shelters that were beyond just to sleep in. The first time I went there, I met somebody, an Afghan man, who later became a friend of mine, Osman, who told me an incredible story about how he'd walked across Europe and fallen in Bulgaria in the night, and a stick had gone through his eye, and he was traveling with lots of his friends, but at this point he had to go to hospital in Bulgaria, and he lost his friends, and then they all found each other again in Calais. So he was an entrepreneur. He'd had a shop in Afghanistan, and he was starting to create a shelter that wasn't just to sleep in. It was a shop by day that he wanted to buy and sell and make some money and sleep in the back of it. So that was starting to happen, and that increased over the time that Robert was coming to the camp. We started to see more and more makeshift shops, restaurants, mosques, a hammam, things like that can't literally appear out of the mud, a school, a library, beautiful things that, when left to your own devices, people are very resourceful, and that really showed. But initially... And
living side by side, right?
Absolutely. The mosque was next to the church. And I remember when I asked somebody, is that ever a problem? They looked at me like I was crazy and was like, no, we're literally fleeing war. We're here because we want peace. That is what we want. That's what we're here for. That's why we made these journeys,
And from all over the Middle East, right, at the time. So Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, basically anyone fleeing war at that time.
Yeah, and beyond, not just the Middle East. I think that at the time, again, I had a naive idea that I associated the word refugee with the war in Syria, that I would be meeting Syrians. There was a small community of Syrians in the camp, but there were also Africans, lots of Eritreans, Sudanese from the Horn of Africa, fleeing genocide in Darfur, forced compulsory military service in Eritrea. Again, it was a steep learning curve for me to meet people who were representing, the world's worst atrocities, not just the Middle East, and not just war.
So you're here, you're this young person, you're suddenly exposed to these experiences, and something happens, right, to you?
Yeah, something big happened to me. I made the journey back to the UK after that first trip. And I made it in the comfort of my car, with the power of this little book that I happened to hold in my possession. And I crossed the Channel on the Eurotunnel. And I remember just feeling the injustice of that, just not understanding how people in this camp were telling me that they were risking their lives on a daily basis to make this same journey, that they were hiding in the back of lorries and underneath the train and doing crazy stuff to try and get to where I was just so easy to make the same journey that I was. And that just didn't make sense. There were girls my age there that I felt like there's no difference between us. It really, it fucked with my head, I guess. I really didn't understand why this was the case and how it was so. And I definitely wanted to do something about it, and I didn't really know what, but I thought I'd start with what I do know. I'm going to go to the camp again. People told me that they needed basic stuff. They were hungry during the day, they were cold at night. And I thought, amongst my friends, I'm sure there's people that have got tents and sleeping bags that they're not using, warm clothing that they might be able to donate. So I wrote about that first experience on Facebook, which was the kind of main platform at the time that my friends and I would use. And I shared a couple of stories of the people that I'd met, I guess. I don't think there was anything that special about that post, but I think that people were ready to hear a different narrative. And that showed, because that post very, very quickly got a lot of traction and raised a lot of money and raised a lot of physical donations. And we filled warehouses across London. We raised £250,000. And that was really the beginning of the Worldwide Tribe. And things have just been pretty crazy ever since.
Mm-hmm. So you founded the Worldwide Tribe. And what I'm really curious about is, on the one hand, you are storytellers. You tell the stories of individuals, whether they're in the UK or whether they were in Calais. You produce films, you use social media and digital platforms in an incredibly powerful way, and you're able to connect. And as you said, that one Facebook post, because it came from you were connecting with your friends, you were being authentic. You told a story and it translated into donations. How do you define right now the vision or the mission of this organization? Because we can talk a little bit more about the rest of the stuff that you're doing right now. But it's not just, putting posts on Facebook and raising money.
No, lots has changed since then, and we've grown and developed. And we, as you say, really focus on telling stories and sharing stories and amplifying voices. The way that we've been doing that most recently is through the podcast, and each episode shares a heroic journey of somebody who has lived experience of migration. But I would say that, at our core, what the Worldwide Tribe is about is celebrating our differences, celebrating them, recognizing that there's lots of things that unite us and bring us together, and also recognizing that, there are differences and they're beautiful, culture, religion, nationality, race, gender, all of those things that might superficially divide us. Actually, beyond all those things, we're all human, and we need to embrace our differences and celebrate them and recognize that is literally the spice of life. What is more exciting than what are we all craving right now? New things, new people, new cultures, new foods.
I'm really curious for you to just share how you think about, you're authentic, you're telling a story, whether it's through these incredible films. I was just rewatching Jangala, which was, I suppose, one of your first films. And it is about Calais, and it's short. It's 16 minutes long. It has your voice in it. You're very much front and center. And it like sears through your heart. And your point is to inform and to engage, at a very practical level. But no one's going to forget that film. And I'm really curious about how you think about using content and your platforms to keep people interested and engaged in a world where we're so distracted. And equally, these people are still far away for many people, right? And we all have our own problems. And now we're in a pandemic. How do you connect, and how do you think about that? And is it something you think about strategically? Or do you continue to just tell stories in the right way and expect that, you have an audience of tens of thousands of mostly young people, from what I understand, that they're just going to keep caring and going to keep contributing and sharing to your cause?
It's really interesting that you mentioned Jangala. That is the first film that we made about the jungle. And it's interesting that you say that you see me as being front and centre as well, because I made the conscious decision that I didn't want to be in that film. I spoke the voiceover, but I think the way that we've told stories has developed over that time, and where possible, we've worked very closely with people to provide a platform for them to share their own story, basically, in an empowered way. It's not my story or our story to tell, but if my experiences over the last 5 years can serve to connect somebody to the issue, then absolutely, I will make sure that happens. But I guess just to reiterate this point about storytelling, right? One of the things that I've really learned since 2015, I guess, is that, at the beginning, we very much focused on tents and sleeping bags, on warm clothing and distributing stuff. And that was so necessary at the time. And that is still so necessary. People are not having their basic needs met in Calais still. And it's life-saving in many cases. But I just believe that camps like Calais and the jungle shouldn't exist at all, right? People shouldn't be in these situations at all. So how do we actually get to the root of the problem? And for me, it's education, it's understanding, it's awareness. And that's what the stories are trying to achieve, for people to shift their mindset when it comes to immigration. And I believe that that's where the real change will kind of stem from. I can't even remember your question now, Suhair. I've just gone on a tangent.
No, but so actually, because I was now thinking about what you've just said, is you're empowering people, you're telling their story, but actually when you give someone a platform and a voice, that in itself is empowering them to say, this is my voice and I deserve to be heard. And, when I said you're front and center, for me, that you're acting as somebody who's saying, it's okay, I'm here. I'll help you tell your story. And I think that, we have to figure out now, because there's so much information out there in the world, it's hard to kind of tell what to pay attention to, how best to communicate. And you're empowering by platforming people. And equally, I know that, you've worked on installing Wi-Fi in refugee camps. You've done work that actually gives that one further empowerment to people to have a voice, to connect and to communicate. And that in itself is part of the narrative of what you do. My original question was about your platforms and how you're connecting and how you're using social media in a really smart way at a time where people are, have lots of content to look at. I think, this is my opinion, it's thoughtful, it's informative, it's never angry, it's never belaboring a point. You're an activist, you've been talking recently about Napier Barracks, and I'd love for you to talk about that. But I remember that you've been posting that. I follow zillions of people on Instagram, and I'm following your stories and your journey. And you have graphics, you have your own voice, but you have an organization behind you. And I know it's something that you probably don't think about the way a brand would do, but I'm asking you because a lot of brands just, can't do it. And the fact that you're doing it about stuff that isn't fancy or flashy is actually extremely powerful. And I wonder if you even think about that, because maybe you don't.
Yeah, I have to be honest and say that anything that we share is stuff that comes authentically from me. There is not a strategy in place when it comes to content or sharing. It is very much what I feel needs to be shared and what I feel is important. That's the extent of the strategy, really.
I love that. And thank you for saying that. I mean, the other stuff, I know you somehow are able to also, because, again, it's authentic, but to think about things like, what is the story that matters? Is maybe climate change is going to be the thing that affects refugees in a way it's going to affect all of us. But what we forget is it's probably going to disproportionately affect people who are in refugee camps or displaced and don't have access to running water. And you're able to connect connect for us also the impact on people who don't have access to the resources that we do. And for me, that's also, it is informative. It's not just you're making a point about somebody's life. You're bringing it back to things that we can act upon. And so that leads me to my next question, which is around your goals. So I know, I don't even know how you would define yourself. I would be curious, as a social activist, as a campaigner. But for me, you're also looking at, the longer term policy of how we treat people in refugee camps, how we deal with these spaces and places and these individuals. And I wonder how much you think about, how do you change policy to protect people, and what is the language you use to do that? I would be really interested in your sharing a little bit of that and where you see yourself in that discourse, given that not much has been done in the broader world to make change, but you have incrementally worked on initiatives that have led to better outcomes for these individuals in many cases.
Well, let's talk about semantics. Let's talk about your point on language. It's very in my mind at the moment because, I don't necessarily relate to the word activist or social activist, or I don't seem to kind of connect with that label. And this idea of labels is something that I definitely want to unpick a lot, because it's the same when it comes to refugee, asylum seeker, illegal immigrant. All of these things, I think, put somebody into a box that if you were to close your eyes and think of a refugee, you would have a specific image, right? You're probably thinking of someone in a boat carrying their bags. And for me, it's dehumanizing on one level, but it's also polarizing. It's separating you. We don't necessarily relate to the word refugee. We can't imagine being a refugee, but what we can relate to is some of those feelings, some of those emotions, being new somewhere, not being welcome somewhere. Those are things that we can relate to. And I'm trying to kind of dig beneath these boxes that we put ourselves in when it comes to defining ourselves and others. And I understand the value of doing so, but I also understand that, language is important, and we are moving away from terms like refugee and asylum seeker and using displaced people, because another point to make, I think, is that this is a passing state. This isn't something that you are. People had a life before they were a refugee. They'll have a life after. They've got a life in the future. It's something that is happening to them as a result of circumstances, and circumstances outside of their control. Semantics, something that is a big topic at the moment when it comes to how we are communicating and how we can connect with people. I've gone on a tangent again. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
No, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for really... For the most part, when you work in maybe my world or just in general, all of us are trying to get through life. It's much easier, right, to put things into boxes. And we've had with these open-ended conversations, most of the people that are coming on board for these conversations would say, "Oh, I studied as an architect, but please call me an artist." And and not to box themselves, but to say, I don't want to be just defined by the thing that I studied. I want to be defined as, what I see myself as. And I think it is so much easier and so much more convenient to look at anybody and to reduce them to numbers or to box. And it's probably less difficult when it happens to me, and I find it increasingly hard where people say, well, what do you do? Why are you doing this? What are you getting out of this? Why would you put your time into this? And you said, well, why should I have to, as long as it's something that you liked or weren't offended by, why do we have to keep trying to prove that something should have value in somebody else's eyes or fit the boxes of, I don't know, what they see as which is, Robert's story, which we started off with. But equally,
we're all so beautifully complex, and each and every individual, Suhair, you've got so many strings to your bow that it wouldn't do you justice to put you into any one box, right? And I totally think that applies for every single human being. If you actually take the time to listen, it is funny how in society we have these specific kind of questions that we ask when we first meet someone that put them into a category that makes you understand their context. oh, what do you do? Where are you from? You know, these questions that
How old are you?
How old are you? And again, I think that's cultural. Like, I recognize that, like, with my little brothers, they think that we're very stuck on age, very fascinated by age. That's something that
Really?
isn't. Two of them didn't even know their age when they came to UK. It wasn't important. They were just them, who they are, showing up. And also the question, where are you from? That's loaded too, right? Like, we maybe come from a country that it's okay and for us to talk about, that hasn't turned its back on us, that hasn't completely washed its hands of us. But for somebody else, that might have a lot of trauma attached to it. And it's one of these things that, what is it that we're trying to do with these questions? Why are we asking these questions? Why not just ask someone like, tell me about you. What are you interested in? What do you like? You know, tell me about you. I want to know about you, your interests, your passions, Can
I ask you a question, though? A tangential question is, I wonder now, this last year, so we've all been kind of blown out of the water as, well, where are you and where do you live and what do you do? And everything kind of has been put on this weird pause. But as borders feel like they matter more than ever, as walls go up, as we feel more siloed and isolated in so many different ways. And, there's so many changes that have already come into place in our lives and how we make choices, how we're allowed to make choices. What do you see happening with the idea of, where we go in the future in terms of making these connections, both for displaced people as well as just more generally in society? As somebody who is trying to remove the boxes, who's thinking about this as part of your work and your practice, where do we go from here?
Well, my dream, don't you? You know that, like, I'm putting this case forward for, we do live in an era of globalization as well, and that we can come together as one worldwide tribe, and that there is huge power in that. But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right when it comes to borders and nationalities, and we do live in a divisive time, right? But I feel that on the other hand, we also live in a period where all of those things can be transcended literally in the palm of your hand. Like, you can cross those borders, you can connect with people, you can listen, see, speak to people from all over the world in a way that we have never been able to before. And that is such an incredible gift as well that we need to make the most of and celebrate. That there are difficulties, and I recognise that we're in this era of post-Trump and lots of fear and lots of, rhetoric that increases that fear. But we also have the ability to find out for ourselves beyond that. Be curious, don't listen to everything that you read in the media. Find out for yourself, make those connections, use social media as a platform to curate your feed, follow the people that you're inspired by, that you're interested in. I do think that we have power in social media, in the internet, to see beyond that fear.
Yeah, that's really hopeful and really powerful, and thank you for sharing that. So I have one more question about your work, because you've talked about this a little bit in this conversation, is when we talk about people who are displaced, that's a temporary state. They came from somewhere, they belong to somewhere, they're present wherever they are, and then they go on somewhere. How much of your work or time is spent in thinking about once people arrive? And as we know, refugee camps like Calais last for many years. You come and you end up staying. In Pakistan, we still have millions of refugees from Afghanistan, where they came to camps that became slums, that became villages, that became cities, and to use this as an example, many of them never became citizens and never really were allowed to integrate and to belong, and others seem to have found a way. And so how much do you work on that in terms of, once you are displaced, similar to putting Wi-Fi into the camp, similar to talking about their issues, how do you make them belong, or to feel like that displacement is over and they're now home?
Integration, right? This integration piece is so important, and I'm so grateful to you for bringing that up, because
Sorry, I don't understand.
Don't know what that was. All these interruptions. There's 4 of us working from home at the moment, so we're all kind of on top of each other here. But yes, where are you right now? Are
Integration. I'm in Islamabad. Yeah, I'm like, I'm gonna, let's see how long I stay, but I got here in end of January. I was in South Africa for 5 weeks, stuck.
South Africa in January is actually the best thing ever.
It was great. It was really beautiful. And it was a time to think about, what does it mean to be someone who doesn't belong, frankly. All my flights were cancelled. And there was a mutation of COVID and everything, there was anxiety, and people treated me with so much love and kindness and welcoming. And not for a second did I feel like I wasn't expected to stay on. And there is always something about feeling like, I really the whole time was like, oh my gosh, how nice of them. How lucky am I? What does it mean now? How grateful do I have to be? And by the end of it, I realized they had created a space for me and I was home, and there was no questions. It wasn't about what was useful about me or which box, as you said, I fit into. People were just generous and open and realized, regardless, I was going to be stressed and anxious about some stuff, and why not help me make the most of it? And, we're all lucky. We all have had access to kindness and generosity from people we know and even people that we don't know. But I found this year that, it does matter more than ever to be kind, to reach out. All of us feel brittle. And, when you talk about your work and working with people who are infinitely brittle and vulnerable, and actually all I've heard from you is stories of kindness and openness, and you come from all over the world, and I'm sure these people come from really isolated communities, and suddenly they're living side by side, and to be able to be generous to each other, just in that there is so much to celebrate and to of the human spirit, but equally to allow people to create their own circumstances, maybe outside of the boundaries of what we think is acceptable in the situations that we, create with government, society. I don't know, maybe it's a segue into your work right now with Napier Barracks, because I think that is sort of a great example of everything should be fine. This is one of the richest countries in the world. Mm-hmm. There are so many policies and laws in place to protect people who are displaced, and yet, I'll let you talk about it.
It's so true, Suhair, and this piece about integration is so important, because actually this year with COVID, it's made me realise that this is all happening closer to home than I ever even realised. I thought Calais was on our doorstep. Actually, there's a refugee camp in the last few months, has been a refugee camp in Kent, in my own home county, right? And I think COVID has, in some ways, changed and been a blessing for the work of the Worldwide Tribe, because it's made us realise that actually, that we don't need to travel all over the world to have impact, that there are many refugees and asylum seekers and displaced people in the UK who need support, and we can literally do this right here on our doorstep. So integration, a lot of people, a lot of refugees that I work with say that when they get to their country of the end point of their journey, whether that be the UK or Germany or France, a whole nother journey begins that is often even more difficult, because you are thrown into something that is completely different from your expectations often. And especially in the UK, you have a rigorous process to go through to be accepted, for your asylum to be accepted, for your claim to be heard, and you're kind of guilty until proven innocent when an asylum seeker in the UK. You're questioned, you have to prove your case for asylum. And I really appreciate you bringing up Napier Barracks, because as I say, the last few months has seen us have the first refugee camp of its kind in Kent. It's called Napier Barracks. It's an ex-army barracks, and it's not fit for purpose. Basically, our Home Secretary decided to repurpose this army barracks to house 400 asylum seekers, people who had recently arrived to the UK, vulnerable people who had experienced war, persecution, trauma. Everybody there has experienced trauma. And during a pandemic, they are living in very close quarters, bunk beds next to each other, resulting in a COVID-19 outbreak and over 100 positive cases of the virus. And not everybody was tested. No ability to socially distance, no access to proper food or healthcare. It's just been a truly shocking thing to witness unfold over the last 4 months. And we've been doing lots of advocacy for it to be closed down imminently, to call for its immediate closure. And there are, at the moment, on the time of recording this, 50 men still inside the barracks. Lots of people have been taken to they have been rehoused, which is a good thing. Things are moving in the right direction. But we don't know whether this means the closure of the barracks or whether it means that maybe the Home Office will do a little bit of refurbishment and move more people in. But the thing is, the fact that it's an army barracks in itself, there's live artillery, you can hear in the background, people are traumatized. They need support. They need to feel safe. That's at the core of this, I guess. And the barracks definitely didn't enable that or allow that for the residents there. So we just put out a podcast episode about the barracks. It was a few months worth of research and speaking to one of the first residents there, an incredible poet from Yemen. We call him S in the podcast, and he speaks very beautifully about his time there. And thankfully, he's one of the people that has left the barracks now. He's now staying in hotel accommodation, which by no means is the kind of hotel that, anybody listening to this might conjure up in their head when they think of a hotel. The conditions are still substandard, but it's better than Napier Barracks. And, these people are desperate to be able to start a life, be able to support themselves, be able to work. But whilst you are waiting for your asylum process or your asylum claim to be heard in the UK, you're not able to work. You're not given that permission. And that limbo state is really, really difficult mentally and emotionally for people. So absolutely, that's something that we need to work on, and we need to recognise needs to change here in the UK.
Thanks for sharing that. I mean, beyond the fundamental celebrating our differences and our similarities, there is this fight for justice. Maybe fight is not the word you want to use to define this, but for me, across the layers of who you are and what you do, there is this really fierce voice that is out there pushing for justice and for fairness. And that in itself is incredibly moving. And you are this force in person. So I wish we could have been together in person to even have these conversations. We have to...
Where that comes from, Zuhair, just want to say quickly that, we're all connected, whether we like it or not, right? Like, we can't just forget about these people that are so close to us, that are like literally, I know, it feels like you can walk past someone on the street who's homeless and just forget that, that's happened, or read something in the newspaper and turn the other page and continue with your life. But deep down somewhere within you, it's there, that it's there and you feel it. And unless you, I think, actively take actions to actually do something about your responsibility as a global citizen, in this space, then that feeling deep within, that will just continue to grow.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think the last thing to say is that there is something really powerful about having, what we call role models, people that inspire us wherever they're from. And, to see you and your journey will inspire a lot of us to think differently about that. Is you can't just turn the other way. You could, but something is left behind. And can you think about that and acknowledge that in the moment or later on? We've taken up a lot of your time, but I do have to ask you to close this off. All of our guests share with us a call to action to close off the conversation. And I wanted to know if there's any one thing that you'd like to share with our listeners.
Yes, absolutely. My call to action is be curious. Scratch those itches of curiosity. Don't believe everything you read. Don't take everything that you see just as gospel. Dig beneath the surface. So I would say that, maybe volunteering in a camp or donating money might not be accessible to you. You might not have the time to spare or the money to spare, but there are things that you can do in your everyday when it comes to this cause, watching a film about the refugee crisis, reading a book. My friend Gawali Pasali, he wrote an incredible book called The Lightless Sky about his journey to safety as a child refugee. That's one I would recommend. For Sama is an incredible film on 4OD. It's again an incredible filmmaker. Ward made it about her life in Aleppo under siege. I mean, there's so many resources out there. Our podcast, I'm biased, but the Worldwide Tribe podcast shares so many incredible stories of just heroic journeys that people have taken and the learnings that have come from those journeys. So I'd recommend that too. So yeah, my call to action, just stay curious, keep asking questions,